Keir Watson here. In this talk, I'm going to be asking what I feel is the central question of this whole referendum, which is Europe sufficiently democratic for us to be attached to it? And what I'm going to be looking at is whether our democracy has actually embraced European democracy to the point where we can feel confident that Europe is somewhere we need to be, somewhere we can be, somewhere we have some democratic say in. So the term democratic deficit is bandied around. The Leave side say Europe's unaccountable, undemocratic, corrupt. The Remain side say no, it's not undemocratic because we vote for our MEPs. Some people even think that because we vote on the basis of proportional representation that it's more democratic than Britain. The problem with that assertion is it assumes that voting is the key to democracy. And I would say voting, whilst essential, is not the most important part of a democracy. The most important part is what we see in this picture. It's the debating, the engagement, public being involved, being on the telly, everybody seeing their MPs, knowing the issues and talking about them. And we've seen that continuously. There's nearly 24-hour coverage, if you want it, during this referendum. And as well as knowing our MPs, we also lampoon them, make fun of them. That's all part of being democratically involved. So take a look at these four dodgy geezers. So you know these characters well, you know them by name, but you also know, more importantly, something of their background, their party politics, where they're coming from, what they stand for, what they've said. That's being engaged with your politicians. It means you know them. So have a look at the next four characters. This was the year before our national elections in 2015, and it was for the EU Commission President. So here are the four candidates. How many of them do you know? You might recognise Juncker, who is the current EU Commission President on the right-hand side. But the other three, and even Juncker, do you know what his politics are? Do you know if any of these guys are left or right-leaning? Are they liberals? How would we classify them? What do they stand for? Fact is, we know very little about them. We're just not engaged with them. We weren't engaged with their election. We didn't follow it on telly. And our newspapers gave very little comment on it. We're basically in the dark. These, by the way, are the 5 presidents. Most people don't realise that the EU has 5 presidents. All of them are paid more than the Prime Minister, and yet very few people could name more than 1 or 2 of them, and to know there's 5 is shocking to most people. And what does it say that we know more about American politicians than we do about EU ones? Another really important part of our democracy is that our lawmakers and those that govern us, they have to present themselves and present the case for what they're doing in the House of Commons, in the public eye. Therefore, all these laws they bring in are scrutinised by the Parliament, by the government, by the opposition, by the House of Lords, and by all of us through the media reporting on that. And that makes them very accountable, and it makes the ordinary person's opinion very important to them. In fact, so important is public opinion because of the weight it has on losing votes and the next election, that they put a lot of effort into getting laws right. For example, over the last 6 years, the Tories have had 24 U-turns that I could dig up. Not all of these, I'm saying, were 100% due to public opinion, but a large percentage of them were, and they backed down on these through the scrutiny process, which I think is an essential part of our democracy. Are you aware of anything similar to this in the EU? In place of public opinion, the EU mainly seems to rely on lobby groups to get feedback. And of course there's lots of problems with that. Now, Transparency International showed in 2014 that 3/4 of high-level, behind-closed-door lobby meetings with EU commissioners were from big corporations. People like Microsoft and Google are spending €4 million a year on their lobbying activities in the EU. Second, NGOs, non-governmental organisations. They only account for 18%, but my understanding is that commissioners think that their opinions are particularly important because they're very close to the opinions of the people of Europe, they believe. Now, I don't know about you, but NGOs aren't elected, and as far as I'm concerned, they don't speak for me. The other thing is, these NGOs often take EU funding, which does imply a conflict of interests. We know a lot about our democracy. We get information continuously through the TV, the radio, the newspapers, online. We're kept informed about the politics that are relevant to the British. But you'll notice that even in a time when there's a heightened attention on Europe during the referendum, that the headlines really are all still focused on Britain. They're telling us about the effect of Europe on Britain. What we don't get is any news coverage of the actual issues going on in the EU itself. So here's an EU news website. There aren't very many of them because there isn't that much coverage of what's going on in Europe. But if you have a look at the headlines, I think you'll see that you weren't even aware of these issues. You didn't know through our media that these are the kind of questions being asked at the European Union. So when we think about Europe, it's a kind of a vague thought. We are not democratically engaged. We don't have media coverage. We don't really know what's going on. And that's not good for us democratically. Now, this image is doing the round on social media, and it's quite funny, but it shows that our political instincts are focused on our politicians so much that we misunderstand what we're saying. Of course, the referendum is not about Gove. It's not an election. It's not about even the Tories. The referendum, as they say, is for life. Whoever's in power is going to have to deal with the results of the referendum, and this just shows that we've got such an instinct for attacking our politicians that really the European question we find difficult, even in the referendum, to focus on objectively. Cameron hasn't helped. How much more of a statesman would he have been if he'd stood back and said, we're completely neutral on this, the government is, this is a matter for the people, it's their referendum. If he'd said that, he'd still be in place, whichever way it goes. But as it stands, no one believes that in case of a Brexit, he'll be able to stay on. And of course that leads to problems, because it means when he says that he's putting forward the case that he thinks is best for Britain, it's tainted with the fact that we know he's fighting for his political life. And he was playing dirty when he said that Leave can't agree what their plans for post-Brexit Britain would look like. 1 minute we're urged to follow Norway, the next minute Canada. A few days later, Switzerland offers the path forwards. As though the Leave campaign can't make up its mind. But he knows full well it's not up to the Leave campaign. If, in the case for Brexit, it will be up to the government of the day to decide how to go forwards. So Leave can only put out some of the possibilities. It'll be up to the government to decide what kind of relationship to form. It could be like Norway, it could be like Canada, or it could be uniquely British. Turning our attention back to Europe, let's have a look at what goes on behind closed doors. In the following clip I'm going to play you, we have Greek Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis, who attempted to negotiate his country's EU bailout in 2015. And here he's talking to Paul Mason in an interview with Guardian Live. Some of the things he says are very insightful and very pertinent to this talk.
What is it that you want to change about the structure and the constitution of Europe that would allow it to, as you say, democratise itself?
Do you remember what Tony Benn used to say about this? That in a democracy you have to be able to look at the people who have power over you and ask them a number of very simple questions. What powers do you have? Who gave them to you? How are you using them? On whose behalf are you using them? And how can we get rid of you? Yeah? To have democracy, it's not enough to have elections. You must have a body politic which is represented by a sovereign parliament, which can ask these questions of its rulers and can get rid of them. Now, the greatest economy in the world at the moment is the Eurozone, in terms of size, complexity, importance, and so on and so forth. It is run by the Eurozone, and it's run by the Eurogroup, right? Now, I can assure you that these decisions are made in a way that if you knew It's a bit like sausages. If you know what's in it, you don't want to touch it. If you knew how the Eurogroup operates, if the German citizens, French citizens, and this is what I'm up to these days, I'm trying to create mischief throughout Europe by effectively being a whistleblower and telling them what goes on in there on their behalf. Would you believe it that there are no minutes taken so the citizens of Europe can never find out what their representatives said on their behalf? Would you believe that the ministers of finance sitting around that large rectangular table make decisions on Greece, on Portugal, on Spain, on France, without having been briefed about the data or the proposals that are being put before them to decide upon? Never briefed. Once I suggested that I send by email to the other ministers of finance my proposals regarding the bailout deal. And I was warned that if I do that, it would be casus belli, a cause for war. And any proposal that I emailed to my fellow ministers of finance would be disqualified from the conversation.
Why?
I never understood the answer to that question. I put it to them, and I was told by Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble, the German Minister of Finance, that if I did that, he would then have to be obliged to submit my proposals to the Bundestag, the federal parliament in Berlin, which I didn't think was such a disaster anyway. And then, if that happened, a debate on my proposals would begin in the Bundestag before we had it in the Eurogroup, which would mean that we wouldn't be able to have it in the Eurogroup. And if you do it, then I'm never going to discuss these proposals with you. This contempt for the parliamentary process, for transparency, is part and parcel of the democratic deficit. Now, let me put it differently. Here in Britain, you have a system of government that leaves much to be desired. Yet, when George Osborne takes a decision, he has to appear in front of the House and defend it. And the House of Commons has the authority to dismiss him. Now, when we decide in the Eurogroup, we are the government, the economic government of the Eurozone, yeah? We make a decision based on precisely zero information. The decision has already been made behind closed doors in dark corners of those terrible buildings. We all then meet. The representatives of the Troika speak first. So first is the commissioner, Mr. Moscovici, who speaks on any subject, Portugal, Greece, whatever. Then the president of the central bank, then the managing director of the IMF, which is not even part of Europe. Yeah? And then the ministers, on the basis of what they heard, not on any documents that they have in front of them, on the basis of what they heard from the Troika, have 10 minutes each to say some inanity, because you can't say anything serious when you are not briefed. And anyway, there's no negotiation. This process lasts for about half an hour, maybe 2. And then we spend 3 hours debating the only thing to which we're contributing, the press release. Yeah? And that's how European law and European economic policy decide. Then everybody comes out and nobody defends it. Yeah? So the Spanish finance minister goes to Spain, goes to Madrid, goes to his parliament. And if somebody says to him, but what was this idiocy that you agreed upon at the level of the Eurogroup? You know what he says? Oh, it was the best I could do, I was only one, there were 18 against me. But everybody says that. Schäuble goes to the Bundestag, he defends himself by saying, oh, this is the best I could do. So in the end, nobody's responsible.
So the EU's remote and undemocratic, that certainly seems to be true. But what about corrupt? When I've heard accusations of EU corruption in the past, I've thought, yeah, but what about our government? In fact, when you put the two side by side and you look at the levels of corruption in the British system and in the European system, they are orders of magnitude apart. Take a look at this report. It was commissioned by the European Parliament and it came to the conclusion that there is £800 billion wasted a year on corruption within the EU. That's 800 billion. That's staggering. And with Britain being the second largest contributor to the EU budget, you would have thought that our public would have been up in arms at this story, But there it was in the papers back in March, and that figure 800 billion just somehow floated over our heads. Very different thing when we look at similar allegations in our own country. Consider the expenses scandal of 2009. We had MPs falling on their sword for relatively paltry sums of £1,645 for, in this case, for an ornamental duck house claimed on expenses. It's not even clear if that was strictly illegal, but the British public couldn't tolerate it, and he had to go. How different to what goes on in the EU, and how different are we in attempting to hold them to account? In the next clip I'm going to show you Daniel Hannan. He's a South East MEP, and he's in the European Parliament using his 60-second slot to try and make a point about EU corruption.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The title of this report is A Satirist's Dream, Closing the Gap Between Anti-Corruption Law and Reality. I could fill my 60 seconds talking about the 18 years' worth of unaudited accounts, or the bazillions that are squandered on agriculture and foreign aid boondoggles, or the Tillack case where instead of any of the alleged fraudsters being arrested, it was the journalist trying to find out about them who found himself banged up by the police. I could talk about the £6.6 million spent last year by European commissioners simply on entertainment and luxury gifts and hotels. I could talk about the wonderful spectacle of President Van Rompuy and Commissioner Ashton flying to the same meeting in Russia in separate private jets, leaving Brussels within 4 hours of each other. Instead, I'll confine myself to saying this. These things happen not because the EU attracts particularly bad people. I mean, of course it attracts some bad people, man is fallen, and like all institutions it contains those who give in to temptation. It happens rather because there is no link between taxation, representation and expenditure at Brussels level. It was Milton Friedman who said there's two kinds of money in the world, there's your money and there's my money. The trouble is that in the EU it's all your money, hence negligence, corruption, fraud and what we see before us today.
I trust that I've established in this talk the amazing democratic accountability that we have in our country, and showed that it appears totally incapable of operating effectively at the European level. The British do have a remarkable democratic instinct, but like fish in water, we fail perhaps to realise it is there. Where did it come from? Well, for that you'll need to listen to Part 2, Democracy, the Anglo-Saxon Way. Thank you for listening.